I'd like to tell you a story that happened to the poet Naomi Shihab Nye. She writes, I had been wandering around the Albuquerque airport terminal after learning that my flight had been delayed for 4 hours. And I heard an announcement. If anyone in the vicinity of gate A4 understands any Arabic, please come to the gate immediately. She says, well, one pauses these days. Gate A4 was my own gate, and so I went there. An older woman in full traditional Palestinian embroidered dress, just like my grandmother wore, was crumpled on the floor and wailing. Help, said the flight attendant. Talk to her. What is her problem? We told her the flight was going to be late, and she did this. So I stooped, put my arm around the woman, and I spoke haltingly. Shadawa, Shabidik, Habibti, Stani Shwe, Min Fadluk, Shabitsui. The minute she heard any words that she knew, however poorly used, she stopped crying. She thought the flight had been canceled entirely. She needed to be in El Paso for a major medical treatment the next day. But I said, no, you're fine. You're going to get there, just late. Who's picking you up? Let's call him. We'll use my phone. We called her son, and I spoke with him in English, and I told him I would stay with his mother till we got on the plane. She talked to him, and then we called her other sons just for the fun of it. Then we called my dad, and he spoke to her for a while in Arabic and found out that, of course, they shared 10 friends. Then I thought, just for the heck of it, why not call some Palestinian poets that I know and let them chat with her? This all took about 2 hours. And she was laughing a lot by then. She was telling about her life, she was patting my knee and answering questions. She had pulled a little sack of homemade mammal cookies, little powdered sugar, crumbly mounds stuffed with dates and nuts from her bag, and she was offering them to all of the women at the gate. To my amazement, not a single traveler declined one. It was like a sacrament. The traveler from Argentina, the mom from California, the lovely woman from Laredo. We were all covered in the same powdered sugar and smiling. There is no better cookie. Then the airline brought out free apple juice, and 2 little girls from our flight ran around serving it, and they were covered with powdered sugar too. And I noticed my new best friend, we were holding hands by now, had a potted plant poking out of her bag, some medicinal thing with green furry leaves, such an old country traveling tradition. Always carry a plant, always stay rooted somewhere. And I looked around that gate of late and weary ones and thought, this is the world that I want to live in. The shared world. Not a single person at that gate, once the confusion stopped, seemed apprehensive about any other person. They took the cookies, and I wanted to hug all those other women too. And she concludes, this can still happen anywhere. Not everything is lost. I begin with this simple story of human connection because the normal, everyday lives of the world's 1.6 billion Muslims, there's about 2.1 million Christians, there's about 1.6 billion Muslims, those average everyday lives too often get lost amongst the headlines about the horrifying acts committed by a few. An extensive study of media coverage of Islam showed that in the first decade of the 21st century, stories about Islam related to militants and extremists rose from 2% to 25%, but the stories of ordinary, average, everyday Muslim lives remained the same, not 1%, but 0.1%. So as we continue to hear more and more about the worst aspects of Islam, we continue to hear almost nothing about the vast majority of Muslim lives. As one interfaith leader says, I was giving a talk in Kansas City some years ago, and someone stood up and said, "What the heck is wrong with you Muslims?" My response was that if the only thing I knew about Kansas City was the first minute of the local news that I watched the previous evening, I would say, "What the heck is wrong with you Kansas Cityans?" If the only thing I know is the murders and the other crimes that I hear about in the evening news, I would have a very skewed view of who you are. When many Americans hear the word Muslim or Islam, the first association is often something along the lines of Osama bin Laden. Most Americans don't know about Tawakkol Karman, who in 2011 became the first Arab woman and the second Muslim woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize for her work as a Yemeni journalist and human rights advocate during the Arab Springs. Or Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London and the first Muslim to become mayor of a major London capital. Sadly, it's the extremists on both sides that get much more coverage by the media because they make for, if it bleeds, it leads, than the huge numbers of moderate folks on both sides in the middle. I'll limit myself just to two among many possible examples. On the extreme Islamophobia side, a few years ago, it was disheartening to witness all the media attention given to Terry Jones, a fundamentalist pastor of a congregation with only a handful of members, when he decided that he would take it upon himself to create International Burn a Quran Day. Why do we amplify the voices of hate mongers and give other people watching our news the impression that that is representative of Americans? On the other side of extreme Islamism, most of you can likely recall the video of a small group of Palestinians celebrating in the streets and burning an American flag after September 11th. Yes, that small group should be condemned, but that clip was frequently replayed as if it were representative of how all Muslims felt. Here's the missing context. Of the 27 press releases released by major U.S. Muslim organizations that condemned terrorism between 2001 and 2003, 2 of those 27 received any sort of media amplification. Of those 2, 1 was released the day of 9/11 and was quickly overshadowed, of course, by the coverage of 9/11 itself. In the years since 9/11, there has been regular criticism of moderate Muslims for their failure to condemn radical Islam. Here's the problem. Many moderate Muslims repeatedly have, but often no one is paying attention or remembering when they do. In addition to the previously mentioned statement released the day of 9/11, Thomas Friedman, for example, a columnist for the New York Times, famously called out moderate Muslims in one of his columns, failing to remember that in the New York Times, within a month after the attacks, there was a full-page ad that contained statements from many prominent Muslim leaders denouncing the attacks. 3 days after the attacks, 40 prominent Muslim leaders released a statement that we condemn in the strongest terms the incidents which are against human and Islamic norms. Signatories included not only the General Guide of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, they included one of the founders of Hamas in Palestine. Hamas was, for the most part, against the 9/11 attacks. According to Gallup, 93% of Muslims in Muslim-majority countries believed the attacks were unjustified. But tragically, we in the U.S. squandered much of that goodwill and continue to do so in our extended response to 9/11. 15 years later, we are still embroiled in wars in the Middle East, which continues to foster resentment in countries whose citizens, as we would also do not welcome a years-long occupation by foreign soldiers. Now, don't get me wrong, there are legitimate criticisms to be made of fundamentalist Islam, just as there are legitimate criticisms to be made of literalist, absolutist, and reactionary aspects of fundamentalist Christianity, fundamentalist Judaism, fundamentalist Hinduism. I could go on. But Islamophobia is not about legitimate criticism. It is about unfounded fear anxiety, and hostility about Muslims. And I'm interested in doing whatever small part I can do to diffuse Islamophobia because it is irrational, because it encourages anti-Muslim hate crimes, and because it increases the sorts of misunderstandings that unnecessarily embolden potential future terrorists. Islamophobia, like homophobia, is playing on that word phobia because it is a fear that is exaggerated all out of proportion to reality. I want our government to investigate and help prevent terrorist threats, but I don't want them to do it in an unreasonable, phobic way that sacrifices our freedom, that sacrifices our civil liberties, and sacrifices our ability to recognize that the inherent worth and dignity of every person obviously includes Muslims. The case of Islamophobia that's gotten the most media attention recently is the burkini. The bikini, which is a weird choice, right? It's the opposite of a bikini, but a bikini meets a burqa. It's a full-body swimsuit for women that maintains modesty standards according to some interpretations of Islam. As someone who identifies as a feminist, I both think it is sexist when a culture requires women and not men to dress in ways that are actually more extreme than they are modest. And I think that women should ultimately have the choice to dress however they want, which includes a burqa, or whatever a woman wants to wear. And here's the more important point for this morning. You can tell that French politicians are acting irrationally and phobically when they began empowering police to go out onto beaches and to tell women wearing burkinis, to take off more clothes or be expelled. The only way in which it seems like a good idea to have police officers ordering women to take off any layer of clothing is from a warped perspective, like Islamophobia, in which fear is overriding rationality. All that being said, I strongly support the liberal turn in religion for both Islam and other traditions. The turn toward individual freedom in religion, liberal from that Latin word libere, meaning freedom. It means taking religion seriously, but not literally, and incorporating the insights of 21st century science into how we practice religion and spirituality. And as I seek to reflect on the future of Islam from a more rational and informed and hopefully less Islamophobic perspective, it's also important, I will grant, to be honest, that by summer 2013, it had become evident that the Arab Spring uprising had failed to produce democracy everywhere except where they began, in Tunisia. Egypt's first democratic government had been overthrown by a military coup that was ostensibly popularly supported. Syria had descended into a brutal and protracted civil war. And Libya has similarly fragmented. It has two mutually hostile elected governments, one in Tripoli and one in Tobruk, while various militias control different sectors of the country. These developments demonstrate that there is no inevitable transition from a popular uprising, youth bulge and social media notwithstanding, to a sustainable social and political movement. And as cues of ISIS videos indicate, not all tech-savvy youth are pro-democracy. It is also, however, not the case that Islam and democracy are incompatible, despite what misinformed Islamophobic pundits sometimes or frequently claim. After all, the world's third largest democracy is Indonesia, which is the world's largest Muslim country. As I said 2 years ago in a sermon on the future of Islam, not only are the overwhelming majority of Muslims neither terrorists nor terrorist sympathizers, but also, contrary to popular stereotypes, not most Muslims aren't Arab. Only 20% of Muslims are Arab. And the countries with the largest Muslim populations, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, Nigeria, those are all democracies. Along these lines, consider that Saudi Arabia has the 16th largest Muslim population, behind countries such as Uzbekistan, Ethiopia, Turkey, and Iran. Saudi Arabia's Muslim population is roughly equivalent to China's Muslim population. The huge number of Muslims outside of the Middle East show both the diversity of Islam in the present and the hope for an increasingly pluralistic and progressive Islam in the future. But here's the even more important twist. Many commentators and politicians claim from a biased Islamophobic perspective that Islam and democracy are incompatible, when obviously they are not. I mean, it is manifestly evident that they are if one only looks around the world. But to see many Muslim-majority countries actively engaged in democracy. However, I invite you to consider that the question of whether Islam is compatible with democracy is a distraction of the ways that the opposite is actually the case. It is Islamophobia and democracy that are incompatible. Islamophobia is a poison on our body politic that is being used in Europe and the United States to scapegoat Muslims and other immigrants. The next time you hear a politician or a pundit scapegoating Muslims or other immigrants, notice the ways that they are doing so in order to fuel nativist, authoritarian politics, to undermine civil liberties, and to decrease pluralism, diversity, and tolerance, all of which are the actual serious threats to our democracy and our freedom. In contrast, what might we do to bring about a more hopeful future? On the systemic level, supporting the transition to clean, renewable energy is not only vital to slowing climate change, it's also vital to stopping petrodictators who we have continually fueled. We continue to give them money to fund radical Islam using money from our oil-based cars and our oil-based economy. On the individual level, we can speak out whenever we witness Islamophobia. We can cultivate interpersonal and interfaith relationships between Muslims and non-Muslims. We can educate the public about Islam, particularly its diversity and the common ground it shares with the West and with other traditions. Perhaps the greatest hope that Islamophobia can be overcome, and perhaps will be, is our history of anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, anti-same-sex marriage, anti-interracial marriage, and other forms of intolerance and bigotry and prejudice slowly giving way to acceptance, inclusion, and eventually celebration as the unknown other becomes increasingly known for the fullness of their humanity, and when you admit that their humanity is just as messy and complex as yours is. Do you remember our opening story from the poet Naomi Shihab Nye? Do you remember what opened up as strangers separated by language and culture, and in the midst of a highly stressful situation, found simple ways to connect and to communicate? In Nye's words, I looked around that gate of late and weary ones and thought, this is the world I want to live in, the shared world. And that not a single person in that gate, once the crying of confusion had stopped, seemed apprehensive about any other person. They took the cookies, and I wanted to hug all those other people too. This can still happen anywhere. Not everything is lost. In that spirit, I invite us to rise and sing together. Let's sing hymn 159. This is my song.